In the grand halls of Eldermere Palace, a priceless royal portrait vanishes, leaving an empty frame and a trail of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, steps into a web of deception involving a meticulous curator, a loyal guard, a passionate artist, and a cunning noble. A hidden replica, a speck of green paint, and a nervous maid's glance unravel a plot of greed and betrayal. In just 30 seconds, dive into a classic mystery where every clue counts, and only Miss Marple can restore the truth. Chapter 1. The empty frame. The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of Eldermere Palace, casting golden pools across the polished marble floors of the grand gallery. The palace, a sprawling edifice of turrets and tapestries, stood as a testament to centuries of royal lineage, its walls adorned with portraits of monarchs long past. Among them the portrait of Queen Alara, resplendent in her coronation robes, had always held pride of place. Its absence now was as stark as a missing tooth in a perfect smile. The heavy gilt frame hung empty, its velvet backing exposed like a wound, and the palace staff moved in hushed urgency, their whispers echoing faintly in the cavernous hall. Miss Jane Marple, a guest of her old school friend, Lady Beatrice Haverford, had arrived at Eldermere only the previous evening, her modest suitcase still unpacked in the West Wing's guest quarters. She had come for a quiet visit, drawn by Beatrice's tales of the palace's gardens and the promise of leisurely chats over tea. But the morning's discovery had shattered any hope of tranquility. Lady Beatrice, her face pale beneath her carefully powdered cheeks, met Miss Marple in the rosewood-paneled drawing-room, where a silver tea service gleamed under a crystal chandelier. "Jane," she said, her voice low but steady, "it's a catastrophe. The portrait of Queen Elaragon, stolen in the night. It's not just a painting, it's a symbol of the realm's stability." Miss Marple, seated in a cushioned armchair, adjusted her spectacles and regarded her friend with those clear, bird-like eyes that missed nothing. Her plain woolen shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and her hands rested lightly on her lap, betraying none of the keen curiosity stirring within. "A theft of such boldness," she remarked, her tone mild as she poured a cup of tea, "suggests not only daring but intimate knowledge. Tell me, Beatrice, who had access to the gallery?" Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened around her porcelain cup. "Only a few, Jane. The curator, Mr. Grayson, who oversees the collection with almost fanatical care. The night guard, Corporal Reed, a loyal young man, though perhaps not the sharpest. The artist, Cedric Varnhold, who painted the portrait himself. He's been here recently for restorations. And Lord Ashby, a noble with a taste for art, who's been a guest these past weeks. No one else could have entered without breaking the locks, and they're untouched." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already turning over the names like cards in a familiar game. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where thefts were smaller Mrs. Clement's silver teapot or young Tommy's bicycle, but the motives were much the same: greed, envy, or desperation, cloaked in careful plans. "An inside job, then," she murmured, almost to herself. "The frame, was it disturbed?" "No," Lady Beatrice replied, her brow furrowing. "It hangs exactly as it did, but the canvas was cut out, clean as a whistle. The police are coming. Inspector Crane, a competent man, I'm told, but so dreadfully blunt. I fear he'll trample through this like a bull in a rose garden." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Competence is valuable, Beatrice, but delicacy often finds what force overlooks. May I see the gallery?" Lady Beatrice nodded, rising with a rustle of silk, and led her friend through the palace's labyrinthian corridors. As they walked, Miss Marple noted the servants' furtive glances, the way a footman hesitated before turning a corner, the maid who clutched her duster a little too tightly. Small things, but to Miss Marple, they were threads in a tapestry yet to be woven. The gallery itself was a long, high-ceilinged room, its walls lined with portraits and landscapes, each a jewel in the crown of Eldermere's heritage. The empty frame dominated the far end, its ornate gold catching the light in a mockery of its former glory. Miss Marple approached it slowly, her sensible shoes silent on the parquet floor. She tilted her head, studying the velvet within the frame, the faint dust disturbed along its lower edge. No signs of a struggle, she observed. The thief was precise. And yet, to leave the frame, that's curious. Lady Beatrice shivered, though the room was warm. What do you mean, Jane? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said only thieves, like villagers, have their habits. Some take everything. Others leave clues they don't even know they've left. She turned, her gaze sweeping the room, lingering on a high window where the latch seemed slightly ajar. I think, Beatrice, this puzzle will unravel itself, given time and a little observation. As they returned to the drawing room, the distant sound of boots announced Inspector Crane's arrival, his voice booming through the halls. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her hands once more in her lap. But her mind was already at work, piecing together the first fragments of a mystery that promised to be as intricate as any she had encountered in her quiet village. Chapter 2. The suspects assembled. The library of Eldermere Palace was a sanctuary of oak and leather, its towering shelves laden with volumes that whispered of history and secrets. The room bathed in the soft glow of late morning light filtering through leaded windows was an imposing stage for the gathering that now took place. The air was thick with tension, as if the very books held their breath, waiting for the drama to unfold. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near a marble fireplace, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, observed the scene with the quiet intensity of a hawk watching a field. Her presence, unobtrusive yet oddly commanding, went unnoticed by most, save for Lady Beatrice, who stood by the window, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. Inspector Crane, a man whose broad shoulders and bristling mustache suggested a military past, stood at the center of the room, his notebook open and his expression one of barely concealed impatience. His voice, gruff and authoritative, cut through the murmurs of the palace staff lingering at the edges. Right then, he began, surveying the four individuals seated before him. A priceless portrait doesn't just vanish into thin air. One of you knows something, and I'll have the truth before the day's out. His eyes, sharp but lacking the subtlety Miss Marple prized, darted from face to face, seeking a crack in their composure. The suspects, as Miss Marple noted with interest, were a study in contrasts, each a distinct thread in the tapestry of this mystery. Mr. Harold Grayson, the curator, sat ramrod straight, his thin frame almost swallowed by the plush armchair. His spectacles glinted as he adjusted them repeatedly, a nervous tic that betrayed his unease. His suit, impeccably pressed, seemed a shield against the chaos of the theft, but his fingers, clutching a leather-bound ledger, trembled faintly. Beside him, Corporal Thomas Reed, the night guard, slouched slightly, his uniform crisp, but his youthful face etched with worry. His hands, broad and calloused, rested on his knees, as if ready to spring into action, though his eyes avoided the inspector's gaze. Cedric Varnhold, the artist, lounged with an air of affected nonchalance. One leg crossed over the other, his velvet coat a splash of color against the somber tones of the room. His dark hair artfully disheveled, and his expressive hands, which gestured as he spoke, suggested a man accustomed to commanding attention. Finally, Lord Percival Ashby, a noble of impeccable lineage, sat with the aloof dignity of one born to privilege. His tailored waistcoat and polished boots spoke of wealth, but his pale blue eyes, cold and assessing, hinted at a mind that weighed every word. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly as she studied them, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where the village hall had once hosted a similar gathering after the theft of the church's silver candlesticks. The players were different farmers and shopkeepers instead of nobles and artists, but the undercurrents of guilt, fear, and bravado were strikingly familiar. She tucked the observation away, her face serene, as Inspector Crane began his interrogation. "Mr. Grayson," Crane said, his tone sharp, "you're in charge of the gallery. Explain how a thief waltzed in and out with a painting under your nose." Grayson's lips tightened, and he pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose. "Inspector, the gallery is secured with double locks, checked daily. I inspected them myself yesterday afternoon, and they were intact. The portrait was there at 6 o'clock when I locked up. I can't fathom how anyone entered without breaking in." His voice, though steady, carried a note of indignation, as if the theft were a personal affront to his meticulous nature. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Grayson's hands, noting the faint ink stains on his fingers, a detail she filed away. A curator, she mused, was a man of records, of precision. Yet precision could mask obsession, and obsession could lead to oversights or intent. She recalled Mr. Pritchard, the St. Mary Mead librarian, whose fastidiousness had hidden a penchant for borrowing rare books. Grayson's agitation, she decided, warranted closer scrutiny. Crane turned to Corporal Reed, who straightened abruptly, as if caught dozing in class. "And you, Red, you were on duty last night. Did you see anything? Hear anything?" Reed's face flushed, and he rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as one of discomfort rather than deceit. "No, sir," he said earnestly. "I patrolled the gallery every hour, like always. It was quiet as a church. I checked the doors, the windows, everything was locked tight. I swear it." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. He reminded her of young Billy, the butcher's apprentice, who'd been blamed for a missing ham until the true culprit was found. Yet Reed's insistence on a flawless patrol raised a question. Had he been too routine, too predictable? Crane's gaze shifted to Cedric Varnhold, who met it with a theatrical sigh. "Really, Inspector, this is absurd. Why would I steal my own masterpiece? The portrait of Queen Alara was my triumph, a work that captured her very soul." He waved a hand, as if dismissing the accusation as beneath him. "I was in my studio all evening, painting. Ask anyone." His voice carried a note of defiance, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers toyed with a paint-stained cuff, a restless motion that belied his confidence. Artists, she knew, were passionate creatures, and passion could twist into possessiveness. She thought of Mrs. Elwood, the village painter, whose obsession with her landscapes had led to a feud over a borrowed easel. Varnhold's flair, she suspected, might conceal a deeper motive. Finally, Crane addressed Lord Ashby, whose expression remained impassive, as if the proceedings were a minor inconvenience. "Lord Ashby, you're a collector, I'm told. A man with your means might see a portrait like that as a prize." Ashby's lips curled into a faint, disdainful smile. "Inspector, my collection is curated through legitimate means. I have no need to stoop to theft. I was in my rooms last night, reading. My valet can confirm it." His tone was smooth, almost too polished, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered his words. Nobles, in her experience, were not above deceit. She recalled Lord Hartley, who'd misplaced a neighbor's heirloom to settle a gambling debt. Ashby's detachment, she thought, might be a mask for calculation. Inspector Crane paced, his boots thudding against the polished floor. "Someone's lying," he said, his voice rising. "The locks weren't forced, so it's an inside job. I'll have statements from each of you, and we'll search your quarters if need be." The suspects exchanged glances, some wary, others defiant, and Miss Marple noted the subtle interplay: Grayson's quick look at Reed, Varnhold's smirk at Ashby, Ashby's cool indifference. It was a dance of suspicion, and she was content to watch, her knitting a steady rhythm in the silence, Lady Beatrice, standing by the window, cleared her throat. "Inspector, might I suggest a brief recess? This has been a shock to us all, and I'm sure clearer heads will prevail after a moment's pause." Crane grunted his assent, and the suspects dispersed. Grayson hurrying to his office, Reed to the guardroom, Varnhold to his studio, and Ashby to his suite with the languid grace of a cat. Lady Beatrice approached Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. "Jane, I know you've unraveled mysteries before. Will you help? The palace can't bear this scandal." Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression serene but her mind alight with possibilities. "Of course, Beatrice. I'll do what I can. People, you see, are much the same, whether in a palace or a village. They leave traces of their intentions, like footprints in a garden." She rose, her small figure belying the sharpness of her intellect, and followed Lady Beatrice to the corridor, where the palace's grandeur seemed to pulse with secrets. As they walked, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Grayson's nervous precision suggested a man who feared exposure, perhaps of a mistake rather than a crime. Reed's earnestness was convincing, but his youth might have made him careless, or worse, impressionable. Varnhold's passion for his work could be genuine, but passion often bred recklessness, and his studio might hold clues. Ashby's wealth and status made him an unlikely thief, yet his knowledge of art's value was too keen to dismiss. Each, she mused, had a role to play, and the empty frame was merely the opening act. The corridor led to a small anteroom, where a maid was polishing a silver candelabrum, her movements quick and furtive. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching the girl's glance toward the gallery door. "Excuse me, my dear," she said gently. "Did you happen to notice anything unusual last night? Near the gallery, perhaps?" The maid, a slight girl named Ellen, blushed and shook her head. "No, ma'am. I was in the servants' hall after supper." But her hesitation, brief as it was, did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Servants, she knew, saw more than they admitted, just as in St. Mary Mead, where the postman's wife had overheard a crucial quarrel. Returning to the library, Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resumed. Inspector Crane was now questioning a footman, his tone brusque, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She thought of the gallery's high windows, the untouched locks, the precision of the theft. It was a puzzle, she decided, that required not just evidence, but understanding of motives, of habits, of the small human frailties that lay beneath the palace's polished surface. As the suspects returned, their faces a gallery of guarded expressions, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, a quiet metronome to her thoughts. The truth, she knew, was already taking shape, hidden in the glances and gestures of those assembled, waiting for her to weave it into light. Chapter 3. The curator's tale. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Mr. Harold Grayson's office, a small, orderly room tucked behind the grand gallery of Eldermere Palace, shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers and catalogues of the palace's art collection rose to the ceiling, their meticulous arrangement a testament to the curator's fastidious nature. A single desk, its surface bare, save for an inkwell, a blotter, and a neatly stacked pile of papers, stood at the room's center. Miss Jane Marple sat opposite Grayson, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes bright with that gentle, probing curiosity that so often disarmed her interlocutors. A tray of tea, brought by a nervous footman, sat between them, the steam curling upward in delicate spirals. Grayson, his thin frame hunched slightly, as if bearing the weight of the theft, adjusted his spectacles for what Miss Marple noted was the third time in as many minutes. His suit, though immaculate, bore a faint crease at the elbow, and his cufflinks engraved with the palace crest glinted as he gestured nervously. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice a mixture of deference and strain, "I assure you, I am as baffled as anyone. The gallery is my life's work. To think that someone could breach its sanctity, it's unthinkable." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of kindly understanding, though her mind was as sharp as a freshly honed blade. Of course, Mr. Grayson, your devotion to the collection is evident. Such a loss must feel personal. She paused, tilting her head slightly, as if struck by a passing thought. Tell me, how long have you been curator here? Grayson's fingers twitched toward his ledger, a reflex, Miss Marple thought, of a man who found comfort in order. 23 years, he replied, a note of pride creeping into his tone. I began as an assistant to old Mr. Wentworth, cataloging every piece, learning their histories. When he retired, I took his place. The portrait of Queen Elara was my particular charge. Its brushwork, its composition, it's a masterpiece, unmatched in the collection. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Mr. Simmons, the St. Mary Mead churchwarden, whose obsession with the parish records had once blinded him to a pilfered collection plate. A masterpiece indeed, she said. And you inspected it yesterday, you said. At 6 o'clock. Yes, Grayson confirmed, his voice firm but his eyes darting to the side. I made my rounds, as I do every evening. The portrait was in place, the frame secure. I locked the gallery myself, with the master key. Only I and the head steward have copies, and his is kept in a safe. Miss Marple's gaze fell to Grayson's cuff, where a faint smudge of paint blue, she noted, not the green she would later find in the gallery, caught her attention. It was an anomaly for a man so precise, and anomalies, in her experience, were often the first threads to tug in unraveling a mystery. You must handle many tasks, she said, her tone conversational. Frames, for instance, do you ever touch them up? A bit of polish, perhaps, or paint to mend a scratch? Grayson's hand froze mid-gesture, and a flush crept up his neck. Occasionally, he admitted, his voice tighter now. Last week, I touched up a few frames in the east wing. The damp can be unkind to gilt, but I assure you, I didn't touch the Queen's portrait. It was pristine. His words came quickly, as if to fill a silence that might betray him, and Miss Marple noted the slight sheen of perspiration on his brow. Quite so, she said, her smile unwavering. And yet, such a theft requires knowledge of the gallery's routines. You mentioned a shadowy figure near the gallery some days ago. Could you describe them? Grayson hesitated, his fingers tightening around the ledger. It was fleeting, he said at last. A week ago, perhaps, after dusk. I was leaving the gallery when I saw someone in the corridor, near the west entrance. They moved quickly, out of sight before I could call out. I thought little of it at the time. Servants are always about, you know. His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple sensed a reluctance, as if he regretted mentioning the figure at all. Servants, indeed, she mused aloud, thinking of the maid Ellen, whose hesitation earlier had piqued her interest. And yet, a stranger in the corridor might have been more than a servant. Did you mention this to anyone? Corporal Reed, perhaps, or the steward? No, Grayson said, too quickly. It seemed unimportant. I didn't wish to cause a fuss. He adjusted his spectacles again, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. In St. Mary Mead, she recalled, Mr. Thompson, the greengrocer, had once dismissed a stranger loitering near his shop, only to find his till emptied the next day. Small omissions, she knew, could be as telling as grand confessions. She sipped her tea, letting the silence stretch, a tactic she had honed over years of village conversations. Grayson shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. Mr. Grayson, she said at last, her voice soft but deliberate, a theft like this requires not just access but time. The canvas was cut cleanly, the frame left undisturbed. Whoever did this knew the gallery's weaknesses. You've been here 23 years, surely you've noticed patterns, habits, perhaps even lapses. Grayson's face tightened, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might protest, but he leaned back, exhaling sharply. "The gallery is secure," he insisted. "The locks are modern, the windows too high for entry without a ladder, and the guards patrol regularly. If there were lapses, I'd have noticed. I notice everything." His voice carried a hint of defiance, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if he questioned his own vigilance. "Everything," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "That's a heavy burden, Mr. Grayson, even the most careful. I can miss a detail." She paused, her gaze drifting to the ledger on his desk. "Your records, for instance, do they note visitors to the gallery? Artists, perhaps, or nobles with an interest in art?" Grayson nodded, opening the ledger with a practiced hand. "I keep a log of all visitors. Mr. Varnhold was here last month, consulting on a restoration project. Lord Ashby has visited frequently, as a guest of Lady Beatrice. He's expressed interest in the collection, though I found his questions overly specific." He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "He asked about the portrait's provenance, its value. I thought it mere curiosity, but now," he trailed off, his fingers brushing the page. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her face betrayed nothing. Lord Ashby's curiosity, she thought, was a thread worth following, much like Squire Bentley's inquiries about a neighbor's antique clock before it vanished. "And Mr. Varnhold," she prompted. "His work on the portrait, did it involve handling it closely?" "Only to examine it," Grayson said, his tone cautious. "He checked the canvas for signs of wear, but he worked under my supervision. He's a brilliant artist, if a bit temperamental. I can't imagine him involved in this." Yet his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand lingered on the ledger, as if anchoring himself to its order. She rose, smoothing her skirt, her mind already piecing together the fragments of Grayson's tale. The paint on his cuff, the shadowy figure, the ledger's meticulous entries, all were clues, small but significant, like the mismatched buttons on a village thief's coat. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice warm. "You've been most helpful. A man of your observation must find this theft a puzzle worth solving." Grayson managed a tight smile, but his eyes remained troubled. As Miss Marple stepped into the corridor, the weight of his unease lingered with her. She thought of the gallery's empty frame, its velvet backing a silent witness to the thief's precision. Grayson's devotion, she mused, was genuine, but devotion could blind as well as illuminate. She recalled Mrs. Harrow, the St. Mary Mead seamstress, whose love for her shop had masked her son's pilfering of fabric. Was Grayson hiding something, or was he merely a man overwhelmed by the violation of his domain? The corridor was quiet, save for the distant clatter of a servant's tray. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching a faint scuff on the baseboard, barely noticeable against the polished wood. It was too low for a careless foot, too deliberate for an accident. A ladder, perhaps, or a tool dragged in haste. She filed the observation away, her mind turning to the other suspects. Grayson's tale had raised questions, but it was only the first thread in a tapestry that promised to be as intricate as any she had unraveled in her quiet village. Chapter 4. The Guards Vigil. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Eldermere Palace courtyard, where flagstones gleamed from a recent scrubbing and the scent of blooming roses mingled with the crisp air. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stood near a stone bench, her eyes following the measured steps of Corporal Thomas Reed as he approached. The young guard, broad-shouldered and earnest, had the look of a man more at home in action than intrigue. His uniform pressed, but his cap slightly askew, as if adjusted in haste. His face, open and boyish, bore the weight of the morning's accusations, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his cheeks, a sign of unease she recognized from countless village lads caught in minor scrapes. "Thank you for meeting me, Corporal Reed," she said, her voice gentle, almost maternal, as she gestured to the bench. I thought a breath of fresh air might make our chat more pleasant. These old palaces can feel so stifling, don't you think? Her smile was disarming, and Reed relaxed slightly, though his hands clasped and unclasped behind his back. "Ma'am," he began, his voice carrying the soft burr of the countryside. "I don't know what more I can tell you. I told Inspector Crane everything. I was on duty all night, and I didn't see nobody near the gallery." His words tumbled out, earnest but edged with defensiveness, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the way his gaze flickered toward the palace's upper windows. As if expecting scrutiny from above, she settled onto the bench, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her manner that of a kindly aunt inquiring about a nephew's day. "Of course, Corporal, I'm sure you were diligent. A night watch is no small task, and in a place like Eldermere, with all its corridors and shadows, it must feel like guarding a labyrinth." She paused, her tone thoughtful. "Tell me, how do you manage your rounds?" "Every hour, you said." Reed nodded, sitting cautiously beside her, his hands now gripping his knees. "Yes, ma'am. I start at the east wing, work my way through the main halls, then the gallery. Takes about 40 minutes to do the full circuit. I check the doors, the windows, make sure everything's locked tight. Last night was no different. I was at the gallery at midnight, 1, 2, and 3 o'clock. All was well." His voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted a slight tremor in his fingers, a detail that reminded her of young Peter, the St. Mary Mead baker's boy, whose nerves had betrayed him when questioned about a missing loaf. "And between those checks?" she asked, her tone as light as if discussing the weather. "You're alone, I suppose, with time to think. It must be quiet, save for the creaks of an old palace." She smiled, her eyes never leaving his face. "Did you step away at all? Perhaps for a cup of tea or a moment's rest?" Reed's flush deepened, and he shifted on the bench, his boots scuffing the flagstones. "Well, ma'am, I did nip to the kitchen around 2, just for a minute, to grab a cuppa. The night gets long, you know, and the cold seeps in. But I was gone no more than 5 minutes, I swear. The gallery was locked, and I was back before you could blink." His eyes met hers, pleading for belief, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind racing. 5 minutes, she thought, was a narrow window, but a skilled thief needed little more. She recalled the St. Mary Mead grocer, Mr. Hodges, whose brief absence to fetch milk had allowed a thief to slip into his shop. 5 minutes, she mused aloud, her voice soft. "And the kitchen is near the gallery, isn't it? You'd have heard any commotion, I expect." She tilted her head, as if struck by a sudden thought. "Did you see anyone on your way? A servant, perhaps, or one of the guests?" Reed shook his head, but his hesitation was brief, almost imperceptible. "No, ma'am, the halls were empty. Everyone was abed, far as I knew." He paused, then added, "Though I did hear a noise once, around 1 o'clock, like a creak from the west corridor. I checked, but it was just the wind, I reckon. These old walls make all sorts of sounds." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her face remained serene. A creak, she thought, could be a floorboard underfoot, just as the squeak of a gate had once alerted her to a poacher in St. Mary Mead. She leaned forward, slightly, her tone conspiratorial. "You must know the palace well, Corporal, all its nooks and crannies. A guard sees things others miss. Have you ever noticed anything odd about the gallery? Visitors lingering too long, perhaps, or tools left out of place?" She watched his reaction closely, her eyes catching the way his hands tightened on his knees. Reed frowned, as if sifting through memories. "Well, Mr. Varnhold's been around a lot lately, poking about the paintings. Said he was checking for damage, but he spent a lot of time with the Queen's portrait. Asked me once how often I checked the locks, which I thought was strange." He shrugged, as if dismissing the memory, but Miss Marple filed it away, thinking of the village painter, Mrs. Elwood, whose curiosity about a neighbor's china had preceded its disappearance. And Mr. Grayson, she prompted. He's so particular about the gallery. Does he ever join you on your rounds, or check the locks himself? Sometimes, Reed admitted. He's always fussing over the frames, polishing them, or making notes in that book of his. Night before last, I saw him in the gallery late, near 11. Said he was double-checking something. Didn't think much of it, he's always there. His tone was casual, but Miss Marple's mind seized on the detail. Grayson in the gallery at 11, she thought, was a piece of the puzzle. Much like the vicar's late-night visit to the church before the candlesticks vanished. She smiled, her needles produced from her bag beginning to click softly, a rhythm that seemed to soothe Reed's nerves. You're very observant, Corporal. A guard's eyes are sharper than most. And Lord Ashby, has he ever shown interest in the gallery? During your shifts? Reed's brow furrowed. He's been about a few times, ma'am. Likes to wander the halls at night. Says he can't sleep. I saw him near the gallery a week ago, just standing there, looking at the paintings. Didn't say much, just nodded and went on his way. His voice held a trace of unease, and Miss Marple noted it, thinking of Squire Bentley, whose nighttime strolls had coincided with the missing silver tray. She rose, smoothing her skirt, her mind weaving the threads of Reed's account into the broader tapestry. His brief absence, the creak in the corridor, Grayson's late-night presence, Varnhold's questions, Ashby's wanderings, all were fragments, small but significant. "Thank you, Corporal," she said, her voice warm. "You've painted a clear picture of your night. It's the small things, you know, that often lead to the truth." Reed stood, tipping his cap, his relief palpable. "I hope you find who did it, ma'am. It's not right, stealing something so important." He hesitated, then added, "If I think of anything else, I'll tell you." Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging, but as he walked away, she noticed the stiffness in his gait, as if he carried a burden he hadn't yet named. Alone in the courtyard, Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the palace's facade, its high windows catching the fading light. The gallery's windows, Reed had said, were too high for entry without a ladder, yet the locks were untouched. She thought of the scuff mark she'd seen in the corridor, the faint trace that suggested a tool or ladder. Reed's absence was a crack in the night's defenses, but was it wide enough for a thief? She recalled the St. Mary Mead postman, whose brief detour had allowed a letter to be stolen from his bag. Timing, she knew, was the thief's ally, and Reed's routine, so predictable, might have been his undoing. As she turned back toward the palace, a maid-elon, she recognized, hurried past, her apron clutched tightly. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, catching the girl's quick glance toward the courtyard's far gate. Servants, she thought, were the invisible threads of any household, seeing and hearing what others missed. She made a mental note to speak with Ellen later, certain that the maid's hesitation held a clue, just as the butcher's wife in St. Mary Mead had overheard a crucial whisper. For now, though Reed's tale had given her much to ponder, and the gallery's empty frame loomed larger in her mind, a silent challenge to uncover the truth hidden in the palace's shadows. Chapter 5. The Artist's Passion. The air in Cedric Varnhold's studio, tucked in a quiet wing of Eldermere Palace, was heavy with the scent of turpentine and oil paint, a heady mix that clung to the senses like a memory. Canvases leaned against walls in haphazard stacks, some half-finished, others vibrant with color, their bold strokes a testament to the artist's restless energy. A large window, streaked with dust, let in a muted light that danced across easels and scattered brushes, casting shadows that seemed to shift with the mood of the room. Miss Jane Marple, standing just inside the doorway, took it all in with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her shawl draped neatly over her arm, her eyes bright with curiosity. Cedric Varnhold, his velvet coat smudged with paint and his dark hair falling into his eyes, greeted her with a flourish, as if welcoming an audience to a private performance. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, his voice rich with a theatrical lilt. "A pleasure to meet a friend of Lady Beatrice's, though I confess I'm puzzled by your visit. Surely you don't think I had anything to do with this dreadful business?" His smile was charming, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers toyed with a paintbrush, twirling it like a baton. She had seen such charm before, in St. Mary Mead's itinerant poet, Mr. Langley, whose silver tongue had massed a penchant for pilfering manuscripts. "I'm merely trying to understand the puzzle, Mr. Varnhold," she replied, her tone mild as she stepped further into the studio, her sensible shoes silent on the worn floorboards. "Your work is remarkable. This landscape, for instance," she gestured to a half-finished canvas of rolling hills. "It captures such life. The portrait of Queen Alara must have been a triumph for you." Varnhold's eyes lit up, his posture straightening as he seized the opportunity to speak of his art. "A triumph, yes. It was my finest hour. Every stroke, every hewit, was as if the Queen's spirit guided my hand. To think it's gone," he trailed off, his hand sweeping dramatically to his brow. But Miss Marple's keen gaze caught the flicker of calculation in his expression, as if he were measuring her reaction. She thought of Mrs. Elwood, the village painter, whose passion for her work had sometimes veered into obsession, leading to a feud over a borrowed canvas. She moved closer to a cluttered table, her eyes scanning the array of paint tubes and brushes, noting a small jar of green pigment that matched the speck she'd later find in the gallery. "Such skill must require great dedication," she said, her voice warm but probing. "You were here recently, I understand, examining the portrait for restoration. That must have been a delicate task." Varnhold nodded, setting the paintbrush down with a touch too much care. "Indeed, the palace commissioned me to assess the canvas for signs of work cracks fading, that sort of thing. I spent hours with it, under Mr. Grayson's watchful eye, of course." He gave a wry smile, but Miss Marple noted the edge in his tone when he mentioned the curator, as if their interactions had been less than cordial. "The portrait was flawless, as I knew it would be. My work endures, Miss Marple." "Of course," she said, her smile unwavering. "And yet, to lose such a piece, it must wound an artist's heart. Why, in my village, we had a painter once who grew so attached to her work she refused to sell it, even when offered a tidy sum." She paused, her eyes drifting to a canvas in the corner, draped with a cloth, its size strikingly similar to the missing portrait. "Do you ever keep studies or copies of your work, Mr. Varnhold, as a memento, perhaps?" His face tightened, the charm faltering for a moment before he recovered with a laugh. "Studies, yes, sometimes, but a copy of the Queen's portrait? Preposterous. That was a singular creation." He gestured to the covered canvas, his hand casual but his eyes sharp. "That's a private commission, nothing to do with the palace. A landscape for a client who prefers discretion." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly, a rhythm that seemed to unsettle him. She recalled Mr. Langley again, whose private poems had turned out to be plagiarized from a rival. "Discretion is a fine thing," she said, her tone thoughtful. "And yet, a painting like the Queen's portrait, it draws attention, doesn't it? You must have spent many hours alone with it during your restoration work. Did you notice anything unusual? A visitor, perhaps, or a change in the gallery's routine?" Varnhold leaned against an easel, his posture relaxed but his fingers drumming lightly on the wood. "The gallery is a fortress, Miss Marple. Graysons, locks, reeds, patrols, it's all very tedious. I did my work and left, though." He hesitated, as if weighing his words, then continued with a shrug. "I did see Lord Ashby there one evening, lingering by the portrait. He asked about its technique, the pigments I used. Seemed awfully curious for a man who claims to be just a guest. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her face remained serene. Lord Ashby's name kept surfacing, like a weed in a garden. Curiosity can be innocent, she said, or it can be something else. And Corporal Reed, did he ever seem distracted during your visits? Varnhold snorted, a flash of disdain crossing his face. That boy, he's diligent enough, but hardly a scholar. He asked me once how long it takes to paint a portrait, as if it's a matter of hours rather than soul. I doubt he'd notice anything beyond his rounds. His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of irritation, as if Reed's simplicity offended him. She thought of the village blacksmith, whose gruff manner had hidden a sharp eye for detail, and wondered if Varnhold underestimated the guard. She stepped toward the covered canvas, her movements slow and deliberate, as if merely admiring the studious clutter. Your work must consume you, Mr. Varnhold, she said, her voice soft. Such passion can make one protective, even possessive, of one's creations. I wonder, did you ever feel the portrait was too precious to remain in the gallery, exposed to the world? Varnhold's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the room seemed to still, the air charged with unspoken tension. You're a perceptive woman, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low, almost a challenge. But I'm an artist, not a thief. The portrait belonged to the palace, not to me. Its loss is a tragedy, nothing more. He turned away, busying himself with a palette, but Miss Marple noted the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the palette knife a fraction too tightly. She nodded, as if satisfied, though her mind was alight with possibilities. The green pigment, the covered canvas, Varnhold's defensiveness, they were pieces of a puzzle, each fitting into the broader mystery of the empty frame. Thank you, Mr. Varnhold, she said, folding her knitting and slipping it into her bag. You've given me much to think about. An artist's eye sees the world differently, doesn't it? Sometimes it sees what others miss. As she left the studio, the scent of paint lingering in her wake, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the gallery's scuff mark and the green speck she'd found. Varnhold's studio held secrets, she was certain, just as Mrs. Elwood's shed had hidden a stolen easel in St. Mary Mead. The artist's passion was undeniable, but passion, she knew, could twist into something darker: greed, pride, or a need to reclaim what he felt was his. She made a mental note to revisit the studio, perhaps when Varnhold was absent, and to keep an eye on Lord Ashby's curiosity. For now, though, the threads of the mystery were beginning to weave together, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle taking shape, as intricate and compelling as any she had encountered in her quiet village. Chapter 6. The Noble's Ambition, the opulent suite of Lord Percival Ashby, situated in the eastern wing of Eldermere Palace, was a study in refined excess. Polished mahogany furniture gleamed under the soft glow of a crystal chandelier, and the walls were adorned with a curated selection of miniature paintings, each a jewel-like testament to the noble's discerning taste. A Persian rug, its intricate patterns muted by age, cushioned the floor, and a marble-topped table held a decanter of amber liquid, its stopper catching the late afternoon light. Miss Jane Marple, admitted by a deferential valet, stood near the door, her modest figure a stark contrast to the room's grandeur. Her shawl was neatly folded over her arm, and her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in every detail with the quiet precision of a village spinster accustomed to noticing the unspoken. Lord Ashby rose from a velvet-holstered chair, his tailored waistcoat impeccable, his pale blue eyes cool and assessing. Miss Marple, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, I'm honored by your visit, though I confess I'm surprised. Surely you don't believe a man of my station would stoop to theft? His smile was polite, but it held an edge, like a blade sheathed in silk. And Miss Marple noted the way his fingers rested lightly on the arm of his chair, poised but controlled. "I'm merely seeking to understand, Lord Ashby," she replied, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. Settling into a chair, he indicated, with a graceful gesture, "A theft like this puzzles us all, and your knowledge of art, I'm told, is considerable. Your insights might shed light where others see only shadows." Her words were carefully chosen, and she watched his reaction, recalling Mr. Hartley, the St. Mary Mead squire, whose polished manners had once concealed a scheme to borrow a neighbor's antique vase. Ashby inclined his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You're kind to flatter my expertise, Miss Marple. I do appreciate fine art, its history, its value. The portrait of Queen Alara was exquisite, a Varnhold masterpiece. But I assure you, my interest is purely aesthetic." He gestured to the miniatures on the wall, each framed in gold. "My collection is modest but legitimate. I have no need for stolen goods." His voice was calm, almost too smooth, and Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, began their familiar click, a rhythm that seemed to unsettle the silence. She nodded, her eyes drifting to a particularly fine miniature of a lady in Elizabethan dress, its delicate brushwork catching her attention. "These are remarkable," she said, her tone admiring. "You must spend much time seeking such treasures. I understand you've visited the gallery often during your stay. Did the Queen's portrait hold special interest for you?" Ashby's smile tightened, though his composure held. "It's a striking piece, naturally. I admired its composition, the way Varnhold captured her presence. I may have lingered there, as one does with beauty." He paused, sipping from a glass of brandy, and Miss Marple noted the deliberate slowness of the gesture, as if he were buying time. "But I was in my rooms the night it was taken, reading. My valet, Hawkins, can confirm my whereabouts." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but her mind alert. "A quiet evening, then. Though I've heard you enjoy late-night strolls about the palace. The corridors must be peaceful at such hours, with only the guards about." She tilted her head, her eyes meeting his, and she saw a flicker of wariness, quickly masked. "In St. Mary Mead," she recalled. Mr. Hartley's nighttime walks had coincided with the disappearance of that vase, and his excuses had been just as polished. Ashby leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "Insomnia is a curse, Miss Marple. I find walking helps. The palace is a labyrinth, but I keep to the main halls. I've no interest in skulking about like a common thief." His tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the faint edge of disdain, as if the accusation offended his pride. She thought of the maid, Ellen's glance toward the gallery, and the guard Reed's mention of Ashby lingering near the paintings at night. A pattern, she mused, was beginning to emerge. "Your collection must demand great knowledge," she said, steering the conversation gently. "I imagine you know the value of a piece like the Queen's portrait, not just its beauty, but its worth in certain circles." Her words were soft, almost casual, but she watched his reaction closely, noting the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Value is a crude measure for art," Ashby replied, his voice cool. "But yes, I'm aware of its significance. A piece like that would fetch a fortune, though only a fool would try to sell it. Too recognizable, too traceable." He smiled, as if amused by the idea, but Miss Marple's needles clicked a fraction faster. His knowledge, she thought, was too precise. Much like Squire Bentley's detailed questions about a neighbor's silver before it vanished. She rose, smoothing her skirt, her gaze lingering on the miniatures. "You've been most helpful, Lord Ashby. A man of your discernment sees things others overlook. Did you perhaps notice anything unusual in the gallery? A servant out of place, or a guest where they shouldn't be?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, catching the brief pause before he answered. "Nothing comes to mind," he said, standing to escort her to the door. The gallery was always orderly, Grayson's domain, though I did see Varnhold there once, fussing over his precious portrait, like a mother hen. He's an odd sort, isn't he? All passion and no restraint. His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the deflection, the way he shifted attention to the artist. It was a tactic she'd seen before, in the village, when Mrs. Harrow had blamed her son's friend for a missing brooch. As she stepped into the corridor, the valet closing the door behind her, Miss Marple's mind was alight with impressions. Ashby's polish, his calculated charm, his knowledge of the portrait's value, they were threads in a tapestry that grew more intricate with each conversation. The miniatures, she thought, spoke of a man who coveted beauty, but was it beauty alone, or the prestige it conferred? She recalled the scuff mark in the gallery, the green paint speck, and now Ashby's nighttime wanderings, confirmed by Reed. Each clue was a stitch, and she felt the pattern tightening, though the full design remained elusive. The corridor was quiet, save for the distant echo of a servant's footsteps. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching a faint gleam on the floor, a tiny bead, perhaps from a lady's dress, unnoticed by the maids. She bent to retrieve it, slipping it into her pocket, her thoughts turning to Ellen, the maid whose glances hinted at secrets. Servants, she knew, were the pulse of a household, and this bead, small as it was, might lead her closer to the truth. For now, though, Lord Ashby's words lingered, his ambition a shadow that loomed over the empty frame, as compelling and dangerous as any motive she had uncovered in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 7. A clue in the dust. The grand gallery of Eldermere Palace, with its lofty ceiling and walls adorned with centuries of artistry, seemed to hold its breath in the late afternoon stillness. The empty frame that had once housed Queen Elorez portrait loomed at the far end, its gilt edges catching the fading light like a silent rebuke. Miss Jane Marple moved slowly through the room, her sensible shoes whispering against the parquet floor, her eyes scanning the space with the quiet intensity of a gardener inspecting her roses for blight. She had slipped away from the bustle of the palace's main halls, where Inspector Crane's interrogations continued with all the subtlety of a blacksmith's hammer, to seek the small, overlooked details that she knew often held the key to a mystery. The gallery was deserted, save for a lone maid dusting a distant frame with hurried mechanical strokes. Miss Marple paused near the empty frame, her shawl draped over her arm, her hands free to explore the scene as she had not done earlier in the company of Lady Beatrice. The frame itself was undisturbed, its heavy gold structure bolted securely to the wall, the velvet backing within showing no signs of violence. Yet, as she bent closer, her spectacles glinting, she noticed something Inspector Crane's heavy boots had missed, a faint scuff mark on the floor, just beneath the frame's lower edge. It was subtle, a mere smudge against the polished wood, but its shape suggested the press of a ladder's foot, or the drag of a tool. She crouched, her movements surprisingly spry for her age, and ran a finger along the mark, feeling the slight indentation. Curious, she murmured, her mind flickering to a St. Mary Mead burglary, where a scuffed doorstep had betrayed a thief's entry. Rising, she let her gaze sweep the floor, her eyes trained to catch the anomalies others overlooked. Near the scuff, half hidden in the shadow of the frame, lay a tiny speck of green paint, no larger than a pinhead, its hue vivid against the dust that had settled in the gallery's corners. She knelt again, carefully lifting the speck with a handkerchief, her lips pursed in thought. The color was distinct, neither matching the frame's gold nor the gallery's muted decor. It reminded her of the green pigment she had seen in Cedric Varnhold's studio, and she tucked the handkerchief into her pocket, a small trophy in her quiet hunt. In her village, she recalled, a speck of flour on a thief's shoe had led to the recovery of a stolen pie, and she sensed this paint might prove equally telling. Miss Marple straightened, her thoughts turning to the gallery's layout. The high windows, as Corporal Reed had noted, were too lofty for entry without aid, and the locks, as Mr. Grayson insisted, were untouched. Yet the scuff and the paint suggested a deliberate act, one requiring tools and time. She paced slowly along the wall, her eyes scanning the baseboards, the frames, the spaces where shadows pooled. The gallery, she mused, was a stage, and the thief had played their part with precision, leaving only these faint traces of their performance. Her steps led her to a corner where a velvet curtain hung, shielding a small alcove used for storage. She parted the fabric, revealing a narrow space cluttered with cleaning supplies and a folded stepladder, its rungs worn but sturdy. She examined it closely, noting a faint abrasion on one leg, as if it had been pressed hard against a surface. The mark was fresh, its edges sharp, and Miss Marple's mind connected it to the scuff beneath the frame. "A ladder," she said softly, "but whose?" She thought of Grayson's meticulous rounds, Reed's predictable patrols, Varnhold's access to the gallery, and Lord Ashby's nighttime wanderings. Each could have moved a ladder, but only one had reason to leave paint behind. She stepped back into the gallery, her eyes drawn to the high windows again. One, slightly ajar, caught her attention, its latch not fully secured. She made a mental note to ask Reed about his checks, recalling his mention of a creak in the west corridor. A window, she knew, could be an entry or an exit, just as a loose gate in St. Mary Mead had once allowed a poacher to slip through unnoticed. She moved to the window, her fingers testing the latch, which gave with a faint click. It was not forced, merely careless, and she wondered if it had been left so deliberately. As she turned, the maiden she recognized paused in her dusting, her eyes darting toward Miss Marple, before returning to her task. Miss Marple approached, her smile warm but her gaze sharp. "Ellen, my dear," she said, her voice as soothing as a village gossip's, "you must see so much in your work here. The gallery is such a grand place. Did you notice anything odd recently? A ladder out of place, perhaps, or a stranger lingering?" Ellen's hands tightened on her duster, and she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, ma'am. I just clean where I'm told. I don't notice much." But her eyes flickered again, toward the alcove, and Miss Marple noted the nervous twist of her apron. Servants, she knew, were the eyes and ears of a household, and Ellen's hesitation was a thread worth tugging. She thought of the bead she'd found in the corridor, still in her pocket, and wondered if it belonged to Ellen's dress or another's. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's arm. "You've been very kind." She moved away, her mind weaving the clues together. The scuff, the paint, the ladder, the window, Ellen's unease. Each was a fragment, like the scattered petals of a flower in St. Mary Mead that had led her to a stolen necklace. She recalled Grayson's paint-stained cuff, Varnhold's green pigment, and Ashby's knowledge of the portrait's value. Reed's brief absence at 2 o'clock was a window, but was it wide enough? The ladder suggested planning, the paint a connection to the artist, but the motive remained elusive. As she left the gallery, the palace settling into the hush of evening, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of a puzzle taking shape. The empty frame was more than a theft. It was a challenge, a tapestry of human frailties waiting to be unraveled. She resolved to visit the storage rooms, where ladders and supplies were kept, and to speak again with Ellen, whose glances hinted at secrets yet untold. For now, though, the dust of the gallery had yielded its first clues, and Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew the gossip of St. Mary Mead, that the truth was closer than anyone suspected. Chapter 8. The Hidden Canvas. The storage rooms of Eldermere Palace. Tucked beneath the grand staircases, and hidden behind unassuming oak doors, were a labyrinth of shadows and forgotten treasures. Crates and dust-covered furniture lined the narrow passages, their outlines softened by the dim glow of a single oil lamp that flickered on a wooden shelf. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn close against the chill of the stone walls, moved with quiet purpose through the cluttered space, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Lady Beatrice had granted her access with a hesitant nod, her trust in Miss Marple's discretion outweighing her concern for propriety. "Mind your step, Jane," she had warned. "Those rooms are a jumble, and heaven knows what's been left there over the years." Miss Marple had smiled, her thoughts on the cluttered attic of St. Mary Mead's vicarage, where a lost brooch had once been found among moth-eaten curtains. The air was thick with the musty scent of old wood and canvas, and Miss Marple's sensible shoes made soft thuds against the uneven floor. She carried a small pocket torch, its beam cutting through the gloom as she navigated past stacks of crates and rolled tapestries. Her discovery in the gallery, the scuff mark, the green paint speck, the hint of a ladder, had led her here, to the place where tools and supplies were stored, where a thief might have concealed their preparations. She recalled a St. Mary Mead theft, where a gardener's shed had hidden a stolen silver spoon, and she felt certain that these rooms held a clue to the missing portrait. Her torchlight fell on a stepladder, its rungs worn but sturdy propped against a wall. She paused, her fingers tracing the same faint abrasion she had noted in the gallery's alcove, a mark that matched the scuff beneath the empty frame. "A ladder, indeed," she murmured, her mind connecting the dots. The ladder's presence here was no surprise, but its recent use suggested a deliberate act, one planned with care. She moved deeper into the room, her torch sweeping across crates labeled with faded ink, their contents a mystery to all but the palace's oldest servants. In a corner, half hidden behind a stack of warped picture frames, she spotted a crate that seemed out of place, its wood fresher than the others, its lid slightly askew. She approached, her movements cautious, her heart quickening with the instinct of a hunter nearing her quarry. Kneeling, she lifted the lid with care, revealing a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, its edges secured with twine. Her fingers, deft despite her age, untied the knots, and she peeled back the cloth to reveal a canvas, its size and shape a perfect match for the missing portrait of Queen Elara. Miss Marple's breath caught, not from surprise but from the clarity of the moment. She tilted her torch, the beam illuminating the painting's surface. It was a portrait of the Queen, her regal features rendered with Varnhold's unmistakable skill. But the paint was fresh, its colors vibrant, the edges still tacky to the touch. A replica, she realized, crafted with meticulous care to deceive even the sharpest eye. She examined the frame, noting a faint smear of green paint on its corner, identical to the speck she had found in the gallery. "A copy," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the silence. "But for what purpose?" She sat back on her heels, her mind racing. A replica suggested not just theft, but deception, a plan to replace the original with a forgery, perhaps to delay discovery, or to profit from both the sale of the true portrait and the illusion of its presence. She thought of Mr. Pritchard, the St. Mary Mead librarian, who had once swapped a rare book with a clever facsimile to fund his gambling debts. The green paint linked this canvas to Varnhold's studio, but the ladder and the crate suggested access to the storage rooms, a privilege shared by Grayson and, perhaps, the palace staff. Rising, she rewrapped the canvas, careful to leave it as she found it, and turned her attention to the surrounding crates. Her torchlight revealed no other obvious clues, but she noted a faint trail of dust disturbed on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged recently. She followed it to a corner where a pile of old drapes lay, their folds concealing a small wooden box. Inside, she found a set of painter's tools brushes, a palette knife, and a vial of varnish, its label smudged but legible. The tools were clean, but their presence in this hidden corner struck her as deliberate. A craftsman's kit stowed for later use. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, remained still, but her mind was a whirl of connections. The replica, the ladder, the paint, The tools all pointed to a scheme that required skill and access. Varnhold's artistry was undeniable, but could he have orchestrated this alone? Grayson's knowledge of the gallery's routines made him a candidate, yet his devotion seemed genuine. Reed's brief absence offered a window, but his simplicity suggested he was no forger. Lord Ashby's wealth and ambition hinted at a motive, but his aloofness distanced him from the act itself. And then there was Ellen, the maid, whose nervous glances suggested she had seen something she dared not share. She left the storage room, her torch extinguished, the lamp's flicker guiding her back to the corridor. The palace was settling into evening, its halls quiet save for the distant clink of china from the dining room. Miss Marple paused, her thoughts returning to the replica. Its existence changed the nature of the theft, turning a simple crime into a layered deception. She recalled a St. Mary Mead scandal, where a forged will had nearly robbed a widow of her inheritance, and she sensed a similar cunning at play here. The green paint tied the replica to Varnhold, but the ladder and the crates suggested an accomplice, someone with access to the palace's hidden spaces. As she emerged into the main corridor, she caught sight of Ellen, hurrying toward the servants' quarters, her apron clutched tightly. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, recalling the bead she had found, still in her pocket. "Ellen," she called softly, her voice carrying just far enough to halt the maid. The girl turned, her face pale, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Might I have a word, dear? Just a moment, in the parlor." Ellen hesitated, then nodded, following Miss Marple to a small, dimly lit parlor nearby. The room was cozy, its walls lined with faded tapestries, and Miss Marple settled into a chair, her manner as warm as a village gossip's. "You've been so busy, Ellen," she began, her tone gentle. "The palace is a whirlwind today. I wonder, did you ever see anything in the storage rooms? A crate moved, perhaps, or tools left out of place?" Ellen's fingers twisted in her apron, and she shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, ma'am, I don't go there often, just to fetch cleaning things." But her eyes darted to the floor, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hands. A mirror of young Sally's nerves when questioned about a stolen pie in St. Mary Mead, of course, Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. "But you're about the palace at all hours. You might have seen someone near the storage rooms, or heard something a noise, perhaps, late at night." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind but unyielding. Ellen swallowed, her voice faltering. I heard footsteps once, a few nights ago, near the west stairs. I thought it was just the guards, but it was late, past midnight." She paused, then added quickly, "I didn't see who it was, ma'am. I swear." Her urgency betrayed her fear, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind noting the detail. Footsteps near the storage rooms, she thought, could belong to anyone Varnhold Grayson. Even Ashby, but Ellen's fear suggested she knew more than she admitted. "Thank you, Ellen," Miss Marple said, rising. "You've been very helpful. Don't let this trouble you, dear." As the maid hurried away, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the replica, its fresh paint, a silent accusation. The hidden canvas was a key, she was certain, but to whose lock? The threads of the mystery: Varnhold's pigment, Grayson's access, Reed's absence, Ashby's ambition. Ellen's fear were weaving together, and Miss Marple felt the pattern growing. Clearer, as intricate and inevitable as any puzzle she had solved in her quiet village. Chapter 9. The Artist's Secret. The evening shadows lengthened across Eldermere Palace, casting intricate patterns on the stone walls of Cedric Varnhold's studio. The air within was thick with the familiar temps of turpentine and oil paint. But tonight it carried an undercurrent of tension, as if the very canvases held secrets they dared not reveal. Miss Jane Marple stood once more at the studio's threshold, her shawl draped neatly over her arm, her eyes as sharp as ever behind her spectacles. The discovery of the replica in the storage room had sharpened her resolve, and she had returned to confront the artist, her suspicions now honed to a fine point. Varnhold, his velvet coat discarded in favor of a paint-splattered smock, looked up from a canvas with a mixture of surprise and wariness, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he set down his brush. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying that theatrical lilt she had noted before, though now it was tempered with a cautious edge. "Back so soon? I'd have thought the palace's mysteries would keep you busy elsewhere." His smile was charming, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his gaze, the way his fingers lingered on the edge of the easel, as if anchoring himself against her scrutiny. She thought of Mr. Langley, the St. Mary Mead poet, whose charm had crumbled when confronted with his pilfered verses. "I find, Mr. Varnhold," she said, her tone as mild as a summer afternoon, "that mysteries often lead back to where they began. Your studio is a treasure trove of creativity, and I thought we might continue our chat." She stepped inside, her movements deliberate, her eyes scanning the cluttered space. The covered canvas she had noticed before still stood in the corner, its size a silent echo of the missing portrait, and the jar of green pigment on the table gleamed in the lamplight. A match for the speck she had found in the gallery. Varnhold gestured to a stool, his manner hospitable but strained. "By all means, sit. Though I warn you, I've little to add to our last conversation. The portrait's theft is a tragedy, but I'm merely its creator, not its keeper." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, began their familiar click, a rhythm that seemed to unsettle him. She recalled Mrs. Elwood, whose denials about a stolen easel had faltered under gentle persistence, and she settled onto the stool, her expression serene, but her mind alert. "Your devotion to the portrait is clear," she said, her voice warm. "Such a work must be deeply personal. I wonder, did you ever paint studies of it, perhaps to perfect your technique? In my village, our painter, Mrs. Elwood, often made sketches before her final works. It's such a practical habit." Her eyes flicked to the covered canvas, and she saw Varnhold's hand tighten on the easel, a fleeting gesture that betrayed his calm. "Studies, yes," he said, his tone careful. "Every artist makes them, but the Queen's portrait was a singular vision. I had no need for copies." He moved to adjust a palette, his back to her, and Miss Marple noted the stiffness in his posture, the way he avoided her gaze. She thought of the replica, its fresh paint and meticulous detail, and knew his denial was a thread too frayed to hold. She leaned forward slightly, her needles pausing. "Mr. Varnhold," she said, her voice soft but unyielding, "I found something curious today, a canvas, hidden in the storage rooms, remarkably like the Queen's portrait. A replica, one might say, with paint still tacky and a frame bearing a speck of green, much like the pigment here." She gestured to the jar on the table, her eyes meeting his, and saw a flash of panic cross his face, quickly masked by a forced laugh. "A replica," he said, his voice rising with indignation. "Preposterous. I told you, that covered canvas is a private commission, nothing more. As for the storage rooms, I've no business there. You must be mistaken." But his hands betrayed him, one gripping the palette knife with white-knuckled intensity, the other brushing nervously at his smock. Miss Marple recalled the St. Mary Mead librarian, Mr. Pritchard, whose denials about a forged book had crumbled under similar pressure. "Mistakes do happen," she said, her tone thoughtful, "but paint is a telltale thing, isn't it? And ladders, there was a ladder in the gallery, with marks matching one in the storage room. Someone moved it, someone with access and skill. You were in the gallery often, Mr. Varnhold, examining your work. It would have been so easy to study the frame, the canvas, to plan a replacement." Her words were gentle, but they landed like stones, and she saw his composure falter, his eyes darting to the covered canvas, as if it might betray him. He turned, his face pale, his voice low. "You're a sharp one, Miss Marple, but you're wrong. I painted a study, yes, for my own practice. I kept it hidden because, well, the palace wouldn't approve of such liberties. But steal the original? Never. I loved that portrait." His voice cracked, a note of genuine passion breaking through, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, catching the half-truth. Love, she knew, could drive a man to desperate acts. Just as Mrs. Harrow's love for her son had led her to cover his thefts in St. Mary Mead. "Love is a powerful thing," she said, her needles resuming their click. "It can make one protective, even possessive. A replica, Mr. Varnhold, suggests a plan beyond practice, a way to keep the original, perhaps, while leaving the palace. None the wiser. Did someone approach you? A collector, perhaps, with an offer too tempting to refuse?" She watched his reaction, noting the sweat beading on his brow, the way his eyes flickered toward the door. "No one approached me," he snapped, his voice sharp now, but he faltered under her steady gaze. "All right," he said at last, his shoulders sagging. "I painted a replica, yes, for practice, as I said. I kept it in the storage room to avoid Grayson's fussing, but I didn't steal the portrait. I couldn't. It was my soul's work." His eyes were pleading, but Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the implications. The replica, the ladder, the green paint, they pointed to Varnhold, but the theft required more than an artist's skill, an accomplice perhaps, or a motive she had yet to uncover. She rose, folding her knitting with care. "Thank you, Mr. Varnhold," she said, her voice as kind as ever. "You've clarified much. An artist's heart is a complex thing, isn't it? It sees beauty, but sometimes it sees opportunity, too." She moved to the door, her step slow, giving him time to consider her words. As she left, she heard him exhale, a sound of relief tinged with fear, and she knew the truth was closer, though still veiled in the palace's shadows. In the corridor, the evening hush was broken by the distant clatter of a servant's tray. Miss Marple paused, her thoughts on the replica and Varnhold's confession. The artist's secret was a key, but to what lock? The ladder suggested access, the paint a connection. But the motive, greed, pride, or something deeper, remained elusive. She recalled Ellen's nervous glances, Grayson's stained cuff, Reed's absence, and Ashby's ambition. Each was a thread, and the hidden canvas had tightened the weave. As she made her way to the parlor, her mind turned to the next step. A closer look at the palace's routines, perhaps through Ellen's eyes. For the maid's fear hinted at knowledge that might unravel the mystery as surely as any clue in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 10. The motive unraveled. The dining room of Eldamere Palace glowed with the soft light of candelabras, their flames casting flickering shadows across the polished mahogany table and the intricate tapestries that adorned the walls. The air was heavy with the aroma of roasted pheasant and spiced wine, but the mood was far from festive. Lady Beatrice, seated at the head of the table, presided over a subdued supper, her face etched with the strain of the day's events. Miss Jane Marple, her modest place setting a contrast to the opulence around her, sipped her consomme with quiet deliberation, her eyes moving from face to face as the palace's guests and staff dined in uneasy silence. The theft of Queen Alara's portrait hung over the gathering like a storm cloud, and Miss Marple's mind was alight with the threads she had gathered: the scuff mark, the green paint, the hidden replica, and Cedric Varnhold's reluctant confession. Lady Beatrice, her voice low but steady, leaned toward Miss Marple, her lace-edged napkin twisted in her hands. "Jane, you've been so quiet this evening," she said, her eyes searching. "You've spoken to them, all Grayson, Reed, Varnhold, Lord Ashby. Have you found anything to unravel this dreadful affair? The palace cannot bear this scandal much longer." Her tone carried a plea, and Miss Marple, her needles tucked away, for the moment, offered a reassuring smile, though her thoughts were far from serene. "I'm beginning to see the shape of it, Beatrice," she replied, her voice as gentle as a village gossip's over tea. "It's like a quilt. You know each patch seems separate, but together they form a pattern. The replica I found, for instance, it changes everything. A thief who merely wanted the portrait would have taken it and fled, a replica suggests. A deeper plan, one meant to deceive. She paused, her eyes drifting to the empty chair where Varnhold should have sat. His absence noted by the footman who served the soup. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, her voice dropping to a whisper. Deceive? You mean someone planned to replace the portrait with a forgery? But who would profit from such a scheme, Jane? And how? Her fingers tightened on her napkin, and Miss Marple saw the fear of betrayal in her friend's gaze. A fear she had seen in St. Mary Mead when a forged will had nearly robbed a widow of her home. That's the question, isn't it, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. A replica requires skill, and only one among us has that, Mr. Varnhold. His confession, though partial, confirms he painted it. But the motive, that's where the threads tangle. She sipped her soup, her mind sifting through the suspects. Harold Grayson, with his meticulous knowledge of the gallery, could have orchestrated the switch, but his devotion to the collection seemed genuine. His distress too raw to be wholly feigned. Corporal Reed's brief absence at 2 o'clock offered a window for theft, but his earnest simplicity made him an unlikely forger or mastermind. Lord Ashby's wealth and ambition suggested a collector's greed, yet his aloofness distanced him from the physical act. And Varnhold, his passion for the portrait was undeniable, but was it love, or something darker, that drove him to create a replica? She set down her spoon, her eyes catching a fleeting glance from Ellen, the maid, who was clearing plates with a nervous haste. Let's consider each in turn, Miss Marple said, her voice low, meant for Lady Beatrice alone. Mr. Grayson knows the gallery better than anyone. He could have planned the theft, using the replica to delay discovery, perhaps to sell the original quietly. But his agitation, his stained cuffs, suggest a man caught off guard, not a schemer in control. She thought of Mr. Simmons, the St. Mary Mead churchwarden, whose obsession with order had blinded him to a theft under his nose, and wondered if Grayson's pride had similarly betrayed him. Lady Beatrice nodded, her brow furrowed, and the guard read. He was on duty that night. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly. His 5-minute absence to fetch tea is troubling. But 5 minutes is a narrow window to cut a canvas, replace it with a replica, and escape unseen. He's young, earnest, not unlike the butcher's boy in my village, who was blamed for a theft he didn't commit. Yet his routine is so predictable, anyone watching could have timed it. She recalled Reed's mention of a creak in the west corridor, and the latter's scuff mark, suggesting someone had exploited that brief lapse. And Lord Ashby? Lady Beatrice asked, her voice tinged with reluctance, as if loath to suspect. A noble guest. He's a collector, but surely he wouldn't stoop to theft. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her thoughts on Ashby's polished demeanor and precise knowledge of the portrait's value. He has the means and the motive a collector's hunger for prestige. His nighttime wanderings, noted by Reed, place him near the gallery, and his questions about the portrait's provenance suggest more than idle curiosity. Yet he lacks the skill to create a replica, which points us back to Varnhold. She paused, her mind turning to the artist's studio, the green paint, the covered canvas. Varnhold admitted to painting the replica, claiming it was for practice, but a replica hidden in a storage room, with fresh paint and a ladder nearby. No mere study, it's a plan, Beatrice, and one that required access and intent. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, her voice barely audible. You think Varnhold stole it? But why? He created it, why risk everything? Miss Marple's needles would have clicked, had they been in her hands, but her mind supplied the rhythm. Passion can twist, Beatrice. In my village, a painter once hoarded her work, refusing to sell, because she couldn't bear to part with it. Varnhold called the portrait his soul's work. Perhaps he couldn't let it go, or perhaps someone, a collector like Ashby, offered a price that turned passion into profit. She thought of the bead in her pocket, Ellen's nervous glances, and the footsteps the maid had heard near the storage rooms. There's another piece, to Ellen, the maid. She's seen something, I'm sure of it. Servants always do. Lady Beatrice leaned closer, her voice urgent. What will you do, Jane? Confront Varnhold again. Miss Marple shook her head. Her smile faint but resolute. Not yet. The truth is like a shy creature, it needs coaxing, not chasing. I'll speak to Ellen, and I'd like to see Varnhold's studio again, perhaps when he's not there. The replica is a key, but the original where? It's hidden, and why will tell us the rest. She glanced at the dining room's ornate clock, its hands nearing 9. For now, let's finish our supper. The palace is restless, but the truth will wait. As the meal concluded, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the next steps. The replica's existence pointed to Varnhold, but the ladder and the storage room suggested an accomplice, someone with access to the palace's hidden spaces. Grayson's knowledge reads laps. Ashby's ambition, Ellen's fear, each was a thread. And the motive, she sensed, lay in their intersection. She recalled a St. Mary Mead scandal, where a forged painting had been sold to a greedy squire, and she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle nearing its resolution. The dining room's candles burned low, but Miss Marple's mind was alight, weaving the tapestry of Eldermere's secrets as surely as she had unraveled the mysteries of her quiet village. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The library of Eldermere Palace, with its towering shelves and the faint scent of aged leather, was a fitting stage for the denouement of the mystery that had gripped the household. The room was bathed in the golden glow of oil lamps, their light casting long shadows across the polished oak table where the suspects now gathered. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly at one end, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her eyes bright with the calm certainty of a puzzle nearly solved. Lady Beatrice, her face pale but composed, stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly as she surveyed the assembly. Inspector Crane, his broad frame dominating the center of the room, paced with the restless energy of a man eager to close a case, his notebook clutched like a weapon. The 4 suspects, Harold Grayson, Corporal Thomas Reed, Cedric Varnhold, and Lord Percival Ashby, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a gallery of guarded expressions, each betraying a flicker of unease. Miss Marple's gaze moved from one to the other, her mind weaving together the threads she had gathered: the scuff mark, the green paint, the hidden replica, Varnhold's confession, Ellen's fear, and the bead in her pocket. The tapestry of the theft was nearly complete, and she felt the quiet thrill of truth about to be unveiled, as she had so often in St. Mary Mead. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority, "with your permission, I'd like to share what I've learned. The theft of Queen Elara's portrait is a puzzle, but its pieces are now clear." Crane, his mustache twitching with impatience, nodded gruffly. "Go on, Miss Marple, you've been poking about. Hear it." His tone was skeptical, but he stepped back, giving her the floor. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and dread. While the suspects shifted in their seats, their gazes fixed on the slight, elderly woman whose presence seemed to fill the room. Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her hands clasped before her. "The theft," she began, her tone as gentle as if discussing a village fate, was no simple act of greed. It was a deception, planned with care to leave the palace unaware of its loss. The empty frame was not the crime's heart, but a distraction. The true clue lay in a replica, hidden in the storage rooms, its paint fresh, its frame marked with a speck of green. She paused, her eyes meeting Varnhold's, who paled, his fingers tightening on the armrest. She turned to the group, her voice steady. "Mr. Grayson, your devotion to the gallery is unquestioned, but your knowledge of its routines made you a suspect. The paint on your cuff blue, not green suggested carelessness, not guilt, and your distress was too genuine for a thief. Corporal Reed, your absence at 2 o'clock offered a window. But 5 minutes is too brief for such a precise theft, and your simplicity, like that of a lad in my village, speaks of innocence. Reed exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief, while Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his face a mask of strained composure. Lord Ashby, Miss Marple continued, her gaze settling on the noble, whose pale eyes met hers with cool defiance. Your ambition as a collector and your nighttime wanderings raised questions. Your knowledge of the portrait's value was precise, but you lack the skill to create a replica, and your valet's word places you in your rooms. Yet your curiosity was a thread in this tapestry. Ashby's lips curled slightly, as if amused. But Miss Marple noted the tension in his jaw. She turned at last to Varnhold, whose theatrical charm had faded, his face now a study in barely concealed panic. Mr. Varnhold, she said, her voice soft but unyielding. You admitted to painting a replica, claiming it was for practice. But the replica was hidden, its paint fresh, its frame marked with green pigment from your studio. A ladder, used to reach the portrait, left a scuff mark in the gallery, and its twin was found in the storage room where you had access. You stole the portrait, intending to replace it with the replica, to sell the original to a private collector while the palace remained ignorant. Varnhold sprang to his feet, his voice sharp with desperation. This is outrageous. I loved that portrait, was my masterpiece. Why would I steal it? His hands gestured wildly, but Miss Marple's calm gaze held him, as it had held Mr. Pritchard in St. Mary Mead when his forged book was uncovered. Love can twist. Mr. Varnhold, she said, her tone almost sorrowful. You couldn't bear to see your work belong to the palace, or perhaps a collector's offer Lord Ashby's perhaps, proved too tempting. The replica was your plan to have both, the profit and the illusion of your masterpiece's presence. She paused, letting her words settle, then added, The original was found this evening, Inspector, hidden behind a canvas in Mr. Varnhold's studio, wrapped in oilcloth, just as the replica was. A gasp escaped Lady Beatrice, and Crane's eyes widened, his skepticism giving way to grudging respect. Varnhold's face crumpled, his bravado collapsing as he sank back into his chair. I only meant to borrow it, he stammered, his voice breaking. A collector approached me, yes, but I was going to return it. I couldn't let it go forever. His confession spilled out, a torrent of guilt and pride, and Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on Mrs. Elwood, whose obsession with her paintings had led to a similar confession. Crane stepped forward, his voice booming. Cedric Varnhold, you're under arrest for the theft of the portrait. He signaled to 2 constables, who moved to flank the artist, whose head bowed in defeat. As they led him away, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Lord Ashby, whose expression remained impassive, though she noted a faint tightening of his lips. His role, she suspected, was not entirely innocent, but without evidence of his involvement, she let the thought rest, much as she had with Squire Bentley's unproven complicity in a St. Mary Mead theft. Lady Beatrice approached, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Jane, you've saved us from ruin. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled, her needles now clicking softly, a familiar rhythm of resolution. People, Beatrice, are much the same everywhere. They leave traces, paint, scuffs, glances, that tell their stories. In St. Mary Mead or Eldermere, the heart of a mystery is always human. As the room emptied, the weight of the theft lifted. Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, its threads woven into a truth as clear as the village scandal she had unraveled before. Chapter 12. The portrait restored. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of Eldermere Palace's grand gallery, bathing the newly restored portrait of Queen Alara in a golden glow. The canvas once more secured within its ornate gilt frames seemed to radiate a quiet triumph, its regal subject gazing down with serene dignity. The palace, so recently a hive of whispers and suspicion, had settled into a hush of relief, as if the very walls exhaled now that the scandal was resolved. Miss Jane Marple stood before the portrait, her shawl neatly draped over her shoulders, her hands clasped in quiet contemplation. The scuff mark on the floor had been polished away, the green paint speck swept into oblivion, but the memory of the mystery lingered in her mind, as vivid as any village intrigue in St. Mary Mead. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in a gown of deep sapphire, joined her, her face softened by gratitude and the return of her household's honor. "Jane," she said, her voice warm with emotion, "you've worked a miracle. The portrait is back, the thief is in custody, and Eldermere can breathe again. I don't know how to thank you." Her eyes shone, and she clasped Miss Marple's hand, a gesture of friendship that bridged the gap between palace grandeur and village simplicity. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with that familiar twinkle. "No miracle, Beatrice, merely observation. People, you see, are much the same whether in a palace or a cottage. They leave traces of their heart's greed, pride, or passion, and those traces tell their stories." She turned to the portrait, her gaze lingering on the Queen's painted features, so skillfully rendered by Cedric Varnhold, whose talent had been both his glory and his downfall. She thought of Mrs. Elwood, the St. Mary Mead painter, whose obsession with her art had led to a petty theft, and saw in Varnhold the same tangled knot of devotion and desire. The library confrontation had laid bare the truth. Varnhold's replica, crafted with meticulous care, was meant to deceive the palace while he sold the original to a shadowy collector, whose identity remained elusive, though Miss Marple suspected Lord Ashby's involvement. The artist's confession, wrung from him by her gentle persistence, had revealed a plan born of pride and temptation, a scheme undone by a scuff mark, a speck of paint, and the nervous glances of a maid named Ellen. The original portrait, found hidden behind a canvas in Varnhold's studio, was now restored to its rightful place, and the replica, seized by Inspector Crane, lay in evidence, a testament to the artist's skill and folly. Lady Beatrice followed Miss Marple's gaze, her voice soft. "To think it was Varnhold all along." His passion for the portrait seemed so genuine, yet it drove him to such deceit. "How did you see through him, Jane?" Miss Marple's lips pursed, her thoughts drifting to the village scandals she had unraveled. "Over the years, passion, Beatrice, is a double-edged sword. In my village, I've seen it turn love to jealousy, pride to theft. Varnhold's replica was no mere study. It was a plan to keep his masterpiece close, even if it meant betraying. The palace, the green paint, the ladder, the hidden canvas, they were his footprints, as clear as any left in a garden path." She paused, her eyes flicking to a corner where Ellen, the maid, was polishing a candelabrum, her movements steady now, her fear eased by the resolution of the crime. "And the others?" Lady Beatrice asked, her brow furrowing. "Grayson, Reed, Lord Ashby, were they truly innocent?" Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, would have clicked had she held them, but her mind supplied the rhythm. Innocent of the theft, perhaps, but not of human frailty. Mr. Grayson's devotion blinded him to the gallery's vulnerabilities, much like our churchwarden's obsession with records missed a stolen candlestick. Corporal Reed's routine left a gap, as predictable as a village postman's rounds. Lord Ashby. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "His ambition is a shadow, Beatrice. I suspect he knew of Varnhold's plan, perhaps even encouraged it, but proof is as slippery as a St. Mary Mead rumor. Without it, he remains untouched." Lady Beatrice sighed, her relief tempered by the weight of betrayal. "And Ellen? She seemed so frightened. Did she know more than she told?" Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the bead in her pocket, its origin still a mystery. "Servants see everything, Beatrice, even when they don't speak. Ellen heard footsteps, saw shadows. Her fear was her knowledge, but it was enough to point me to the storage rooms, where the replica lay hidden. She recalled the butcher's wife in St. Mary Mead, whose overheard whisper had cracked a theft wide open, and knew Ellen's role, though small, had been pivotal. As they left the gallery, the palace bustling with renewed purpose, Lady Beatrice paused in the corridor, her hand on Miss Marple's arm. "You'll stay a few more days, Jane. The gardens are lovely, and I'd hate for you to leave so soon after saving us." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts already turning to her quiet cottage, where her own garden awaited. "A day or two, perhaps, but St. Mary Mead calls me home. There's always a puzzle waiting, you know, even in a village." She glanced back at the gallery, the portrait's restoration a quiet victory, and felt the satisfaction of a mystery resolved. As she made her way to her room, her suitcase half packed, she reflected that Eldermere's grandeur was no different from St. Mary Mead's simplicity. Both were stages for human hearts, whose secrets, once traced, revealed truths as universal as the roses in her garden.